Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What is the scariest thing you've ever seen in your life that you can't explain? Story 1. Crying from the coffin.
When I was a child, my mother told me a story that still sends chills down my spine. She grew up in Texas during the 1950s, and one of her most vivid memories was attending a funeral for a boy in her community. He was disabled, and his condition had been a significant burden on his family. When he became ill and passed away, there was an unsettling sense of relief among some people. They whispered that his death might have been for the best. The service itself began as you would expect. People were mourning, but there was also an underlying tension in the air, as though everyone was trying too hard to pretend that everything was normal. Then, in the middle of the service, something shocking happened. There were banging sounds, loud, desperate banging and crying. The noises were coming from inside the coffin. The funeral quickly fell into disarray. People gasped, some cried out in fear, but instead of opening the coffin to investigate, the family made a decision that I still cannot comprehend. They abruptly ended the service, rushed the coffin out, and buried it as soon as they could. Just like that, it was over. I initially thought this was simply a story about something that had happened in my mother's town. However, years later, I learned the truth. I was casually retelling the story to someone, mentioning how unsettling it was, when my mother overheard. She went quiet for a moment before saying, "You know that was my family, right?" I was stunned. The boy in the coffin was not just someone from her community, he was part of her own family. My mother did not elaborate further, and I did not press her for details. But ever since, I have not been able to shake the feeling this story leaves behind. Hearing something like this is one thing. Realizing it is a part of your own family's history is entirely different.
Story 2. The Silent Caller.
When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast and then go to school from there. My grandmother passed away during my junior year in high school, and after that, I started going straight home after school. Around that time, my mother started complaining that when she came home from work, the receiver of the phone, an 80s-style corded push-button phone, next to her bed was always left off the base. I wasn't using the phone, but she insisted I must have because the phone was always properly hung up when she left for work. One day I came home a little early. Let me explain the layout of our apartment. From the front door, I could see directly into the living room, dining room, the door to the kitchen, and a short hallway that led to my parents' bedroom and my bedroom. There was no other door, and the windows were old-fashioned, narrow casement windows with screens. We lived on the 3rd floor. Anyway, as soon as I walked in the door, I clearly heard 2 footsteps coming from my parents' bedroom. I dropped my school bag and ran to the bedroom, which was just a few steps away. When I got there, no one was in the room, but I immediately noticed that the receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was on the floor. It was positioned so that the cord to the base was stretched out as far as it could go. Later, I tried to replicate the placement by shaking the table or tipping the phone, but I could never get the receiver to come off the base. When I tried knocking it off with my finger, it would fall onto the table or next to it. The only way I could replicate the receiver's exact position was by carefully stretching the cord, placing the receiver, then holding it for a few moments. It could not have gotten there by accident. When I found the phone, I hung it up, and it immediately rang. I answered it, and it was my dad. He asked me what was wrong. I asked him why, and he said that he had called, apparently just before I got home, and someone, he thought was me, answered the phone but didn't say anything. He had hung up and tried calling back, finally reaching me after I hung up the phone. I've never figured out what happened. I'm certain I heard footsteps, and I'm equally sure that no one was there. No one passed me, the windows in the bedroom were undisturbed, and there was too much stuff under the bed and in the closet for anyone larger than an infant to hide. After that, my mother never found the phone disturbed again.
Story 3. The Shadow in the Yard.
When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast and then go to school from there. The one event that comes to mind was witnessed by my dad, brother, and myself. It's a two-part encounter, but I still consider it one event. It was around 1998 when my family and I had just moved into an old clapboard house on the edge of town. It had a huge backyard with a 6-foot wooden privacy fence on one side and a metal chain link fence about 4.5 feet high around the other 3 sides of the yard. There were neighbors on one side, a small grass alley behind the yard with a street light, and then another yard. Our bedroom was an old converted sunroom at the back of the house facing the backyard. It had floor-to-ceiling windows all along the back wall, offering a clear view into the yard. We didn't have many options for where to place our beds, so my headboard was against the windows, and my brother's bed was about 8 feet away, with his headboard against the opposite wall and the foot of his bed facing the windows. One night we were up pretty late. I was in my bed, and my brother was in his, just talking about random things when suddenly he got quiet. I thought he had fallen asleep, but then I heard him whispering with a shaky breath. I asked, "What?" And he whispered again. I told him, "Speak up, I can't hear you." He replied, "Don't move, and be quiet," in a forced whisper. I thought he was messing with me, but I looked at him, and my head was facing the windows. He was pointing into the backyard behind my bed. I quickly sat up, turned around, and saw this huge dog head staring almost nose to glass through the window right behind my bed. I was almost nose to nose with this thing, just a single pane of glass, and about 10 inches of empty air separated me from it. When I say I screamed, I mean I screamed. It wasn't my proudest moment, but I was only 10 years old. The creature quickly ducked under the window and ran to the side of the yard, jumping the 4.5-foot chain link fence and bolting off into the darkness. My dad came running into the room with our mum right behind him. We were able to tell them something was looking through our window. Dad ran back to his room, grabbed his shotgun, and headed out the side door into the backyard. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not sure, he didn't find anything. He dismissed it, assuming I had a nightmare. My brother wouldn't admit to seeing anything, so I took the blame and was told to quit messing around and go back to bed. Typical parent response, right? Later that night, about an hour or so later, I begged my parents to let me sleep in the living room because leaving the house wasn't an option, but they refused. I had to sleep in my room again. So once more, my brother and I were in our room with the floor-to-ceiling windows both completely rattled. We huddled in his bed, staring out the windows when we saw the creature walking along the chain-link fence on all fours. The fence came up to its mid-shoulder, and this thing was huge. It sniffed the ground, did a few circles, and then hopped the fence into the backyard like it was nothing. It walked over to the window again, getting nose to glass like it was trying to see in. We were panicking the whole time. My brother was like, "Forget this." And as soon as he stepped off the bed, we heard a loud bang and saw a flash of light. The creature was knocked sideways, but without missing a beat, it turned and ran across the full length of the backyard. It cleared the back chain link fence, the alleyway, and then landed in the neighbor's yard. This was easily a 15 to 20 foot jump, clearing their fence like it was nothing. It was gone in an instant, running up beside that house and disappearing into the darkness on the other side. My dad came tearing around the side of the house with his shotgun in hand and rushed for the side door, slamming it shut behind him. He was screaming and hollering, telling us we had to leave. We packed up and headed to a hotel that night. My mom absolutely refused to believe we saw what we said we saw. And we only lived in that house for about 6 months. It rattled my dad so much that he didn't even want to come back. He told my mom we were going to move the next day, but she wouldn't allow it. After about 6 months, she conceded and we moved. Mind you, this was in the coastal plains region of Texas, where there are no large wild canines. We have stray dogs and coyotes, but nothing even remotely close to how big this creature was. My dad swears he shot that thing with a slug from about 15 feet away with his 12-gauge shotgun, right underneath its left arm, hitting it in the ribs where its vital organs are, and nothing. It just ran off. What freaked my dad out the most was that when he saw the creature jump the fence, it walked toward our window, crouched, but still on its hind legs. It wasn't walking on all fours. Then, when it got to our window, it stood up straighter, and he could tell that while it looked like a dog, its body was shaped wrong. He said it looked like a really stocky person wearing a dog suit, but he could tell it wasn't a suit. Also, when it was walking in circles and sniffing the ground before coming into our yard the second time, it wasn't sniffing for a scent. It was staring at our window, face to the ground, as if it was pretending to sniff the ground to see if anyone would notice it. My dad said he'd had dogs his whole life, and everything about what the creature was doing was wrong. A while later, I asked my dad why he went into the backyard if he thought I was having a nightmare. He told me my brother was the one who gave it away. He said that with how panicked I looked, and how my brother was almost as white as a sheet and wouldn't take his eyes off the window. He realized we had to have seen something. After going back to his room with my mom, he was laying there thinking about it. He decided that if my brother was that scared, then we must have seen something real. He grabbed his gun in case he had to scare some intruder out of our yard. He figured he'd sneak around the garage, out the far side of the house, and to the corner to see if someone was peeking in our windows. He never thought he would see a huge dog-like creature. But when he saw it come up the side fence, with the streetlight in the back alley lighting up the yard, he froze. He was going to sneak back inside until it went up to our window. When it stood up, he said he instantly felt dread, like something was going to happen to us.
Story 4. Caught between two realities.
I went to college in Providence, Rhode Island. My dorm room was shared with my roommate, with beds on opposite sides of the room and desks at the foot of the beds, the usual dorm setup. One day, my boyfriend and I were hanging out in my room. He was lying on my bed while I stood next to it, bending over to grab something. Suddenly, I heard him scream in panic, holding his eyes. He wouldn't immediately tell me why, but eventually, he told me that when I bent over, he saw a shadow behind me that actually resembled him. He was especially freaked out because he had an afro, so the silhouette was distinctive. We didn't really talk about it afterwards, and I didn't mention it to my roommate, who wasn't in the room at the time. A couple of weeks later, I was asleep in bed with my boyfriend when I woke up in the middle of the night. I saw my roommate packing a bag, clearly panicked. She rushed out of the room and didn't see that I was awake, so I didn't say anything. The next morning, I asked her why she had rushed out of the room in the middle of the night. She told me that she woke up and saw my boyfriend sitting at my desk. She asked him why he was up, but then realized that my boyfriend was still sleeping next to me. She believed in ghosts, so she freaked out and left the room. What really freaked me out was that we had never mentioned the look-alike that my boyfriend saw to her, yet it seemed like she had seen the same figure. Living in Rhode Island definitely made me experience some strange things.
Story 5. The haunted radio station.
My very first job was as a radio DJ at a small, hometown radio station in the mid-1990s. This was a tiny building in the middle of a field with a 500-foot antenna out back, and a single road leading from the main road to the front door. The transmitter was located behind my studio, separated by sound-dampening glass, with a light bulb that was always on. The station was so small that you could see the transmitter room's light bulb from the driveway or road. There were only two doors, the front door and the back door in the transmitter room. The back door had no handle on the outside and was always locked from the inside, making it impossible to enter from outside. I worked the evening shift from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. After my shift, the station went off air for the night. I was always the last person there, responsible for pulling commercials for the morning show, cleaning dishes, and completing some production work. Over the course of a year, I experienced several strange occurrences, shadows darting in the corners of my vision, lights flickering, and more. One evening, while preparing for my shift, I looked through the studio doors toward the front door and saw a shadowy figure of a tall man. It appeared, then vanished. When I mentioned this to my boss, she sighed and called someone into her office. Turning to me, she said, "He's seen Jimmy." Supposedly, everyone had seen Jimmy, the original owner of the station, who occasionally checked in. Jimmy was described as a harmless presence, known for flickering lights or turning faucets on. He even whispered my name one night, which unnerved me, but I believed it was him. However, there was another entity at the station, a malevolent, shin-high being that gave me an overwhelming sense of fear. This shadowy figure darted around me and always left me feeling unsettled. One night, things escalated. After everyone left, the ominous feeling intensified. Lights flashed everywhere. A locked office's dot matrix printer started printing on its own. Sailing tiles began shifting, as if struck from below, moving closer and closer to the front door. Then, the locked front door opened on its own. When I approached to lock it again, I saw a coffee cup and cigar on the front stoop, which had not been there before. As I returned to the studio, I was hit by a burst of cigar smoke, though no one was there. Finally, I saw a shadowy figure standing inside the building, silhouetted by the transmitter light. Terrified, I grabbed my keys, left the building, and drove home. At home, I recounted the events to my mom and later began typing the story on my computer. Suddenly, the modem speaker turned on, which it was not supposed to do after connecting. A distorted voice screeched, "Help me," before the speaker turned off. To this day, I cannot explain it. Although I am skeptical of paranormal events, that night remains beyond explanation. Interestingly, Jimmy is still reported by station staff, but no one else has encountered the malevolent entity I experienced.
Story 6. A dream foretold his death.
I have shared this story on Reddit before, and I have been thinking about it a lot lately. It is not exactly a scary thing I saw, but it is something I wonder about all the time, so I will recount it here. My best friend and I often talked about crazy dreams we had. At the time, we were into conspiracies, topics like aliens, the paranormal, and lucid dreaming, so conversations like these were common. When we were about 15 or 16, he told me about a dream where he got hit by a car and passed away. He described it vividly. He was riding a skateboard wearing all black and he could see everyone at his funeral. He even mentioned with a laugh that his crush was at his funeral. It was so real to him that it shook me for a while, but eventually I forgot about it. A few years later, shortly before he would have turned 20, the dream became a reality. He did get hit by a car and passed away. At the time, he was wearing black, his work clothes, and riding my skateboard. His crush was at his funeral, just as he had described in his dream. Very detail of his dream that I remembered came true. I am sure there are parts he told me that I do not recall, but the accuracy of what I did remember left me stunned. I felt like I was losing my mind. I never told anyone about this connection because I could not make sense of it. I often wonder why or how he foresaw this event in his dream, and why he shared it with me. It seems like there must be a reason, but I still do not understand it. This experience left me with many questions, but also gave me personal proof that our souls continue on after we pass away. I wish I could understand why he experienced that dream and told me about it. If I had not lived through this, I do not think I would believe such a story.
Story 7. When a dream became a nightmare.
My grandfather once had an incredibly vivid dream about a plane crashing into houses near Midway Airport in Chicago. In his dream, he was one of the first people at the crash site. He remembered pulling open a door and finding the captain, who had been decapitated. The next morning, he shared this dream with the family over breakfast. They laughed it off, joking about how terrible that would be, especially since they lived close to the area. A few weeks later, TWA Flight 595 tragically crashed into homes near Midway Airport. It was early in the morning, around 5:30 a.m., and my grandfather was on his way to work. The streets were mostly empty, so he ended up being one of the first people to arrive at the scene. When he went to check for survivors, he encountered an unsettling sight. the pilot in the cockpit, just as he had dreamed. I cannot confirm whether the pilot's injuries were exactly as described, but the Chicago Tribune at the time detailed the devastation. Burning gasoline flowing through roof gutters, frantic screams from a mother searching for her children, and firefighters collecting human remains. It was a horrific event. What continues to haunt me is the eerie specificity of my grandfather's dream and the fact that he had told the family about it in advance. This is not a vague coincidence, it was precise and detailed. While it is possible for dreams to align with real events by chance, the uncanny accuracy of this particular premonition continues to puzzle and unsettle me.
Story 8. The Disappearing Man.
In 2013, I was on an hour-long run along a gravel road. This trail was part of a well-known rural rail system, but it was not too busy, and the nearest parking spot was a couple of miles away. I was heading back to my car when I noticed someone walking towards me in the distance. As I got closer, I started to feel that something was off. The figure was an older man, perhaps in his 70s. While he looked clean and not homeless, his entire appearance was unsettling. His skin was grey, his eyes were grey, his hair was grey, and he was wearing an all-grey sweatsuit. What made it even stranger was that he was smiling, not in greeting, but with a full-toothed grin that never changed as he walked down the middle of the path. The man was carrying a large black plastic bag slung over his shoulder. As I approached, an intense sense of unease washed over me. When I was about 20 feet away, I waved a quick hello, hoping for a response, but he did not react at all. He stayed in the middle of the trail, still smiling. The closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt, and then a wave of nausea hit me so strongly that I nearly threw up. The smell was horrific, worse than anything I had ever experienced. A stench I can only describe as worse than death. At this point, all I wanted to do was get away. Running in the opposite direction would have taken me further from my car, so I decided to pass him. I moved partially onto the grass since he refused to budge from the center of the trail. As soon as I passed, I started sprinting. I got about 200 meters away before I turned to look back. He was gone. This was a flat, rural area where you could see for miles in all directions. There was no place for someone to hide, yet the man and his black plastic bag had completely disappeared. To this day, I have no explanation for what I encountered, but the memory of that eerie, grey figure still sends chills down my spine.
Story 9. Alone in the Haunted Office.
At one of my previous system administrator jobs, we were shutting down a smaller data center as it was being consolidated into a larger one. However, we still had to have at least one person there overnight to address any server issues that might arise. We took turns working the overnight shifts. I heard rumors from my co-workers that the place was haunted, but I didn't know much about it. The office space was quite large but completely empty without the usual cubicles or desks. There was just one desk with a few random cables hanging from the ceiling. The only working lights were over my desk, casting light that extended only about 3 feet around me. This was where I spent my week. While I was working on a server for a customer, I heard the usual ambient noises from the distant server room, things like fans and cooling systems running. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something dart across the room. I thought maybe it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But 5 minutes later, I saw it again, and this time I heard a bathroom door open and shut. It was a heavy door, and the mechanism at the top pulled it closed after it was opened. I figured maybe one of my co-workers was there to do a server fix, so I went over to greet them. I waited about 10 minutes, but no one came out. Concerned, I went inside to check if they were passed out or injured, but the bathroom was empty. At this point, I was getting really creeped out. As I left the bathroom, I saw the shadowy figure again, this time moving across the room in my direct line of sight. I immediately turned on the rest of the lights and searched the entire office and server room, sure that one of my co-workers was just playing a prank on me. But no one was there. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, and the rest of the week was calm as well, aside from me feeling extremely nervous sitting at my desk, constantly waiting for something else to happen.
Story 10. The clock that went off at 2 a.m.
Around 25 years ago, I was caretaking a house in a rural area with my now former wife. We had been living there for several weeks, and although the house appeared mostly normal, there was one particular issue that stood out. Every time we came up the stairs from the cellar, we both felt an intense unease, as though something might grab us as soon as we turned off the light. It wasn't something we could easily explain, and this feeling persisted throughout our stay. We had an old-fashioned wind-up alarm clock by our bed, the kind that required physically setting a small hand to mark the desired time. It wasn't something we adjusted on a daily basis, and we typically had it set to go off at 6 a.m. One night, however, we were jolted awake around 2 a.m. by the loud ringing of the clock's bells. This was highly unusual because the clock had always been set for 6 a.m. When we woke up, confused and terrified, I saw a small figure, about 2 feet tall, dart out of the room. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then my former wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described the figure similarly, as a small gremlin-like creature. As if this wasn't eerie enough, when we looked at the alarm clock, we found that the alarm hand had mysteriously moved from 6 to 2 a.m., the time it had gone off. Neither of us had touched the clock to set it, and the feeling of dread that had been lingering in the house only grew stronger. After that night, nothing else like this happened again, but the strange sensation of being watched or followed, especially around the cellar, persisted. We never found a logical explanation for the strange occurrence with the alarm clock and the small mysterious figure, and it remains one of the most unsettling experiences we've ever had.
Story 11. Hello from the darkness.
During my time studying in the UK, I lived in a house with a group of other American students. The house had a story about the ghost of a girl who had passed away while living there. Although I didn't believe in the story, it was fun to play along with the group. The kitchen had one entrance, and immediately to the right was a padlocked door to the cellar, where the ghost was said to have lived. I was the only one with the key. One evening, as we were all feeling a bit homesick around Thanksgiving, we decided to cook a meal together. Because the kitchen was small, we had to get creative with cooking schedules. One girl, who didn't have class the next day, volunteered to stay up late to prepare the turkey. That night, we went into the cellar for the first and only time to get some larger cooking utensils. At 2:04 a.m., I was suddenly awakened by my door rattling, as if someone were pushing against it. I initially thought it was a housemate who had gone to the wrong room. A few seconds later, I heard a scratchy female voice softly saying hello every few seconds. Since my window was open, I assumed it was a drunk girl returning from the pub, so I got up to close the window. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. Just then, I heard hello, clearly behind me. My door rattled again, and then everything went silent. I've experienced night terrors before, and know that I sometimes hallucinate with even a mild fever, so I assumed I was still dreaming and lay back down to sleep. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who had stayed up to cook came to me and said, I had the creepiest night. At 1:50 a.m., I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs, and then the door rattled. At 2:10 a.m., the door rattled again, and I heard footsteps going back down. She told me this before I had shared my own experience with anyone.
Story 12. What happened on the top floor that night?
For years, I worked the night shift in a nursing home and was the go-to person for conducting night checks on the top floor. Despite the many complaints from staff about strange noises such as footsteps or whispers, I never believed in anything supernatural. In fact, I always took pride in being the one to handle things and reassure my colleagues. The top floor was known for its creaks and groans, but I always chalked it up to the old building and the resident. One night I was changing a resident with a colleague, and as we worked, he mentioned hearing the sound of footsteps, like someone walking up and down the corridor. I didn't think much of it at first, dismissing it as the building settling or some other mundane explanation. But then, as I went to fetch bed sheets from the cupboard at the end of the hall, I started hearing the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, this time along with the sound of plastic bags being moved or rustled. It felt odd, like someone was up there, but I couldn't see anyone. I was getting frustrated, trying to focus on what I was doing and dismissing the noises. But as I came back to the resident's room, I looked out into the corridor and saw a shadow pass by. The shadow was large, much bigger than any of the residents or staff. It moved quickly, and I could hear the same steps and plastic bag noises following it. My heart dropped, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I froze completely, unable to move or process what I had just seen. The shadow was gone in an instant, but the noise lingered. I couldn't bring myself to leave the room to check it out, so I called another colleague to come upstairs. I was terrified. Up until that moment, I had always been the one doing night checks without a second thought, never believing in the rumors or stories. But after that night, I couldn't go up there alone again. The fear I felt was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I don't know what I saw that night, but it changed me. I never went back up to that top floor by myself, and I always made sure I had someone with me during the night shifts.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.